In this lesson, we will cover the V-Ray Clipper. First, let's start the interactive renderer. The V-Ray Clipper gives us the ability to cut and see through objects in order to easily take a look inside of them. A core benefit of the Clipper is that it is a non-destructive tool that works only at render time, meaning it does not make any alterations to your geometry. For our scene, I'm going to use the V-Ray clipping plane to see what's inside our garage here. Let's take a look at a couple of different ways we can do this. First, I will switch to the top view and will create a clipping plane by navigating to the V-Ray tab and pressing the Add Clipper Plane button. Now, let's click here in the top view and drag from the center of the building in order to create it. You'll notice in the IPR that there is nothing here now, because the clipper plane is affecting the entire scene itself. Let's go ahead and select the clipper plane and move it up in our perspective view. You'll now start to see the bottom part of the garage model as the plane cuts through it. Let's now stop the IPR and take a look at a few of the clipper options. Go ahead and open the V-Ray Asset Editor, and in the Geometry tab, you will notice the clipping plane listed there. Then click on the right-hand flyout menu, where we can further review the V-Ray Clipper parameters in detail. First, you'll notice that the Use Object Material setting is turned on. If you switch this off, V-Ray will no longer be using the object's material to fill in the holes for the clipping. Instead, the holes will be filled by the material applied to the clipper itself. To demonstrate this, let's drop the Material menu down and then select this blue material I already set up ahead of time. Then let's start the IPR again. As you can see, we can set the color where the model's geometry and the clipper plane meet. This can be especially handy when we want to showcase complex models with lots of details using multiple clippers. Now stop the IPR, and let's also try changing the color to green as well. Then restart the IPR again to see the effect. Feel free to play around with this and adjust the color to your taste. When you're ready to move on, go ahead and stop the IPR. For the purposes of this lesson, I will now switch the Use Object Material slider back on again. Okay, now let's expand the Options menu for the clipper. Go ahead and uncheck the Effect Light setting, and then restart the interactive render. This option determines whether light can pass through the clipping plane. As a result, the inside of the building becomes dark, making everything beneath the clipping plane appear black. This could be useful for giving you additional control for lighting with the clipper. Let's check this option back on again and stop the render. Next, let's take a look at the Camera Rays Only option. Check this on and notice what happens to the reflections. The entire house is now visible in the reflective surface of the ground. This option makes it so that reflections and refractions behave based on the appearance of the original source object, rather than calculating for the clipped version of the object. Meanwhile, the Clip Light's geometry parameter will cut not only through objects, but light sources as well. Enabling this feature will also affect geometry that has a light material applied, such as mesh lights. Let's leave this checked on for now. Next, I'd like to explore another powerful way that we can use the V-Ray Clipper. First, let's right-click on the clipping plane here in the Geometry tab and select Delete. Then, go to the Lights tab and you will see V-Ray Sphere Light Interior. Turn it on and see that it lights up the interior of the garage model here. Now close the Asset Editor, and back in Rhino, go to the Layer tab where you'll find a custom geometry layer. Click on the blue light bulb to switch this layer on. You'll notice that a custom solid geometry, which I set up ahead of time, has shown itself in the viewport. Now let's create a clipper using the shape from a custom object, which will allow us far more flexibility and control for clipping our models. To start, create a new clipper plane in the top view here next to the house. Then go to the V-Ray Clipper button, but this time right-click on it. We'll be prompted for a Clipper Widget object and an object to link, as you can see here in Rhino's command panel. First, select the newly created clipper as the widget object, and then afterwards, choose the solid geometry on the ground here as the object to link to. Make sure you've selected them in this order specifically, and then hit Enter. Now restart the render and notice the effect the clipper mesh has on the ground in our model here. The mesh is now behaving as the clipper object, allowing us to define a specific shape for creating non-destructive cuts in the scene's geometry. Next, open the Asset Editor and in the Geometry tab, select the clipper plane and let's expand the Include Named Objects panel. Switch to Include and then select Concrete. The clipper will now only cut the selected object that is included in the list, in this case the concrete. This enables us to have fine-tuned control over which objects the clipper should affect. I will now draw a render region to see the effect more closely. Notice how the custom clipper geometry is now only cutting through the concrete geometry here, while all of the other objects remain intact. Now let's zoom back out and disable the render region. Then stop the IPR. Once more, let's delete the current clipper plane from the Geometry tab and then close the Asset Editor. Back in Rhino, in the Custom Geometry layer, hide the Solid 01 layer and then unhide the Surface 01 layer by clicking on the respective light bulbs. You will notice now that a vertical surface has appeared, cutting through part of the garage model. Let's apply the same technique for the vertical surface. Select the Clipper Plane tool and draw it next to the house again. Now right-click on the Clipper tool once more, and in this order, select the new plane we just created, and then select the Surface 01 layer, which we enabled earlier. Then hit Enter. Now switch back to the camera view and then start the IPR so we can see the result. You may also notice here that as a result of the clipping, the light that is illuminating the inside of the garage is now visible in the reflections on the ground below as well. Lastly, let's select the different objects from the Include list. Open the Asset Editor, stop the render, and then in the V-Ray Clipper options to the right, expand the Include Named Objects menu again. Let's include the garage door, plywood, sheathing, and water isolation. Now let's start an interactive render again. As you can see, with some of the objects clipped away now as well, we're able to show a much more comprehensive and detailed view of our building and its various layers. You can now experiment more with the clipper by repeating these steps for the other surfaces on your own. Play around with different settings or create some custom shapes to then use for clipping geometry and see how your results turn out. For my final render, I'm going to demonstrate using 3 different clippers by switching on all 3 of the custom surface geometry models in Rhino. Following the same steps I showed you before, I'll then use the Include list to determine which layers of the geometry that the clippers should each affect. And there you go. Now you've seen a few different ways you can use the V-Ray Clipper to play with the visibility of the different layers of your geometry.